Okay, did you start it?
Yeah.
All right. Third part, Truman. Now we'll talk about Truman and the problems he has his administration in Asia. Like I said, we've already seen the problems Ho Chi Minh has had with Truman in Asia, as Ho Chi Minh now finds out that the French are allowed to come back to retake possession of their former colony, Vietnam. But now we'll see the problems that most of that entails. This picture is a picture of General Stilwell and the leader of the Republic of China, Chiang Kai-shek. This is Chiang Kai-shek's wife in the middle. General Stilwell does not think much of Chiang Kai-shek. He believes him to be a megalomaniac. Of all of the general staff in the Pacific, the one who believes and admires Chiang Kai-shek the most is Douglas MacArthur, who, probably because they have very similar personalities. But Chiang Kai-shek has been warning the United States since the very last parts of World War II that Mao Zedong and his followers were going to become a problem in China. And Chiang Kai-shek has been asking for assistance. Truman has not been focusing his attention on Asia. Truman has been concerned about what's going on in Europe. And so Truman's not really been focusing on what's going on in Asia. Now, Mao Zedong in 1949 is going to begin, he's going to be drawn into a war by Chiang Kai-shek. As soon as the Japanese are expelled from China at the end of World War II, Chiang Kai-shek starts rounding up communists. He starts rounding up Mao's people, attempting to re-educate them. Well, the problem for Chiang Kai-shek is in the region where Mao is predominantly Mao's followers. Okay, this is a map here that shows the areas, the primary areas of the Japanese. All of this pink territory is where the Japanese occupied in the region. The Japanese came across Korea, and if you focus on this map, you can see that what they're interested in taking control of are the rail links that go from Manchuria all the way through China, all the way down into Southeast Asia, into Indochina, to where the Japanese can have access to the oil that comes up from the East Indies. Okay, so this is the territory that was occupied by the Japanese. All of these patchwork territory, these areas are communist stronghold. These are communist bases of operation. Okay, and then Chiang Kai-shek's government is over here. Okay, so when the war is over, Chiang Kai-shek starts rounding up some of these communists. And this was a bad plan for him. It was a bad plan for him because they are completely outnumbered by these communist followers. So in 1949, after Chiang Kai-shek starts, the Chinese government starts sending massive divisions, massive armies across this border, across this line, forcing Chiang Kai-shek, his government, and his army down into this little corner of China, and then they escape to the island of Formosa, aka also known as Taiwan. Okay, so today when you get a pair of tennis shoes made in Taiwan, it will probably say Taiwan ROC, right? Because what you have is the Republic of China, and then up here you have the People's Republic of China. Now, the thing for China from 1949 until I guess it's 1974, 72. I'll have to look it up. And from 1949 until 1972, we'll say 72. Every time the United States of America officially says the country China, we're referring to Taiwan. We do not recognize the People's Republic of China, what we call Red China. We do not recognize them as legitimate. We recognize the legitimate government of China as Chiang Kai-shek's old government, which is down in Taiwan. It's not until Richard Nixon goes and he opens up normal relations with China do we have Chinese actually being recognizing mainland China as a legitimate entity of itself. And this is part of the Cold War. It's a big part of the Cold War, because what we view is going on during this Cold War is that the Soviet Union is in control of all of these smaller communist countries. We think of the Soviet Union as the ones who are in control, the ones who are guiding and leading all of these things. And so we will not. We will reject almost 1 billion people. We will ignore their existence and claim that this is China. Now, we will have contact with the People's Republic of China, but only through intermediaries like Canada and India will recognize the country. But we are able to maintain and to keep China out of the United Nations for as long as we can, because we're members of the Security Council, which all you need is one voting member of the Security Council to keep a country out. Now, after 49, the next area of problem. So under the Truman administration, we've got China falls to communism. And then the next thing that's going to happen is Korea is going to fall to communism. What we're going to see is, as far as people are concerned, when they see the document NS68 about the domino theory, we're going to see the dominoes start to fall. We're going to see Russia fall, China fall, North Korea fall, and South Korea is going to be threatened. We become very interested in this concept of containment, and possibly questioning whether or not containment's going to be enough. Now, back again to the end of World War II. When these countries that had been occupied by Japan, China had been occupied by Japan, but China was able to retake control of its own country, okay, under Chiang Kai-shek. When the Japanese were in control of Korea, we split the country in half, and one of the allies accepts the surrender in the north, and the other ally accepts the surrender in the south. The Russians, who actually border North Korea, the Russians will accept the surrender of the Japanese in North Korea, and the United States will accept the surrender of the Japanese in South Korea. In a set number of days, or a set number of years, they're supposed to come together and vote on which government they want to be the leading government of the country. Okay? So once you get the country established, once you get a government established, then the ruling power will leave the premises and allow these people to govern themselves. So what the Russians do is the Russians equips the North Koreans with weapons and tanks and equipment, right, to build its army, to make it a massive, massive army. And then the Russians say, there, we have equipped your government. And the Russians leave. The Russians go back to Russia. The United States, in the meantime, is busy in Seoul, Korea, trying to help them write a constitution. We're doing all the legal justification and all the kinds of things. Matter of fact, we've cut down the size of the American military substantially following the war, because we want people to go home. We want people to go home. In 1950, Kim Il-sung is going to go to Russia, and he's going to tell the Russians that he has a plan to unify Korea. He has a plan to unify Korea. And he wants the Russians to render aid. Well, the Russians tell him, your northern neighbor, who has just experienced a revolution, is going to be able to provide you with much more assistance than we can because they're in such close proximity. So he recommends that Kim go to the Chinese communists to ask for assistance. And so he does. And then in 1950, in September, the North Koreans are going to invade. They're going to invade into South Korea. And they sweep. They sweep. They sweep down to where the entire South Korean army and most of the American forces are right here in a region that's going to be referred to as Pusan. Going to be referred to as Pusan. We are in danger of losing South Korea to the North Korean army. So what's going to happen, the U.S. in September of 1950 is going to be led by Douglas MacArthur, is going to leave Japan and come across to this place called Incheon. And he's going to make a landing on Incheon, and he's going to cut right across the 38th parallel. He's going to cut right up. So all of the North Korean soldiers down here in the south will now be cut off from their supply chains in North Korea. And then Douglas MacArthur is going to start pushing north. He's going to start pushing north. Now Korea is under United Nations protection. Okay? And this is part of the conflict for the Americans when all this starts happening. Douglas MacArthur has been in charge of troops. He's been placed in command of UN forces, not the United States Army. He's in command of the UN forces invading Incheon. Truman believes that what we need to do is contain the communists. So Truman wants MacArthur to just draw that line at the 38th parallel. The Secretary General of the United States, or of the United Nations, the United States, Secretary General of the United Nations wants MacArthur to push the North Koreans back. And he does. He almost pushes the North Koreans back all the way into China. At which point, the Chinese are going to allow something like 600,000 volunteers to render aid to North Korea, and they're going to push all the way back to Seoul. We will trade the city of Seoul about 6 times, back and forth, between these times. It gets so bad to a point that when MacArthur has these guys pushed back, MacArthur's actually going to order 7 atomic bombs to be delivered to Okinawa. Okay? 7 atomic bombs to be delivered to Okinawa. And he has identified 6 Chinese cities that he wants to drop those atomic bombs on to make them stop rendering aid to the North Koreans. So what's the 7th bomb for? Moscow. Because after all, we all know that Moscow is in charge of all the communist countries in the world. We're going to stop thinking that eventually. But up to this point, that's how we believe communism works. This trading back and forth and this fight, and then finally this ordering of the atomic bombs causes Douglas MacArthur to be withdrawn. Causes Douglas MacArthur to be recalled back to Washington. Truman is going to relieve him of command, and Truman is going to, Truman wants to court-martial him because he has exceeded his orders as far as Truman's concerned. But for MacArthur, I'm not under your authority anymore. You placed me under the authority of the United Nations. The United Nations wanted me to liberate North Korea. I'm following my orders. Well, even though Truman desires to basically to fire MacArthur, when he arrives at the airport, MacArthur receives a hero's welcome, a ticker tape parade down the streets of New York. When he gets to Washington, D.C., he is brought before the full House and Senate of the Congress, and he gives an address to the Congress and the Senate. The majority of his speech is blasting Harry Truman and his policy about dealing with Korea. And then at the end of his speech, he announces his retirement from the U.S. military. And he goes to see Truman. What's Truman going to do now? See, but what MacArthur does is MacArthur says it's because of Truman that China fell. It's because of Truman that North Korea invaded. It's because of Truman we almost lost South Korea. So Douglas MacArthur is making the point that Truman would not allow them. Truman, based on his doctrine of containment, had forced them to kowtow and basically just continue to back off of the communists when they could have basically wiped them out. So as we get into this war, in Korea, eventually the United States and Korea, but not until Eisenhower is elected. When Eisenhower is elected, we will finally have an armistice. The Korean War is still officially going on. The war between North and South Korea is still officially going on. The closest we've been to actual legitimate peace talks between North and South Korea has been when Donald Trump attempted to get the North and South Koreans talking again. He's done more, actually, than any president in recent history in attempting to bring peace to those regions. So these kinds of things are happening in Korea at this same time. Most people don't understand this as being a contemporary problem. At this same time, in the 1950s, way down in Southeast Asia, we've got problems with Vietnam that are going to start coming. North Vietnam has been fighting with the French, and they will be fighting all the way into Eisenhower's administration, which is going to be important for us later. Now, here's a couple pictures of Korea. Most people think when they think of Korea, they think of it like Vietnam. Korea is not like Vietnam. Korea is very north, 38th parallel. Korea is mountainous and it's frigid cold winters. It's like way upstate New York. It's like way upstate New York in the wintertime. And so this is what Korea looks like in here. It's not a bunch of jungle fighting. It's this kind of experience. Okay. Now the troubles at home. We'll quickly try to hit this. This is Richard Nixon on the right, and this is Joseph McCarthy on the left. Richard Nixon is on what's called the House Un-American Activities Committee. The House Un-American Activities Committee. This is a committee in the House of Representatives designed to hunt for communists, to look for subversives in society. That's what they do. That's what this committee is set up for, to search out subversives, people who want to overthrow the government. And the Senate committee is the group that holds them on trial. The Senate holds a trial, and the House Un-American Activity Committee sort of serves as the prosecutors. While they're in activity, Richard Nixon uncovers a person who's selling secrets to the Soviet Union. This is how Joseph McCarthy gets such clout. He gets a lot of clout. There's an individual named Alger Hiss. Alger Hiss was appointed. He had worked for Dean Acheson's law firm. Alger Hiss has been appointed by Dean Acheson and Truman to be part of the group that builds the United Nations. And so he goes to New York to help put together the United Nations and spends his time between New York and Belgium and things like that. So Hiss is found to have been selling secrets, giving secrets to Russians. Okay, he comes up on trial. When he's asked about it before the Senate, in the trial, he flatly denies any activity such as that. And so what's going to happen is the House Un-American Activities Committee, they're not going to have enough evidence to actually convict him of it, but the simple fact that he's been accused of it makes them curious. Now, eventually they do capture someone, And this person actually has evidence that the testimony that Hiss gave was not entirely true. And so Hiss is brought back before the committee. He is prosecuted, and he'll be jailed for perjury because he lied to the Senate, and so he'll be put in jail. Now, the entire time all this is going on, Truman and Dean Acheson, his former boss, both constantly stick up for the man. I trust him implicitly. I trust him implicitly. This has got to be some mistake. I trust him implicitly. When the evidence came out that he had actually lied, there's nothing they can do, and Alger Hiss winds up going to jail. I always wondered about that because, contrary to what the press says and all these people, Truman is not soft on communism. Truman never has been soft on communism. But these actions make him look soft on communism. What I think actually happened, this isn't in your textbook, this is kind of a speculation. I think Dean Acheson and Harry Truman sent Hiss to give the Russians false information. I think they were supposed to think that he was going to work for them, but he was feeding them false information. And so when he gets caught doing it, Truman and Acheson can't say, oh, never mind, he's really our guy. He's really our agent. They can't do that because then nobody would believe what he told them. And so essentially what's got to happen is they've got to let Alger Hiss, they let him get kicked under the bus. They let him take the fall for it. But that's sort of this whole notion behind this new civilian intelligence service. The new civilian intelligence service. Richard Nixon here is looking at a piece of microfilm that Joseph McCarthy in one of his news broadcasts has said he's got microfilm evidence that there are card-carrying members of the Communist Party present within the State Department. And so allegedly what Nixon is looking at is the microfilm that McCarthy says is the proof of this seditious activity. Now, when asked by the press if they would allow them to view this microfilm, he won't let them. He says, right, allow you to view the microfilm and let it disappear? No, thank you. And so I'll keep this evidence secure. And so McCarthy is going to go on a rampage. I'll show you, I'll put a couple of YouTube links to some of the McCarthy hearings and let you watch some of the things. People wonder, how can this take place? How can this kind of witch hunt take place? Well, because people get so stirred up and they're so afraid of communism at this point that all they can think of is how do we stop this? And McCarthy, because of Alger Hiss, because of the fact he's prosecuted, because of the fact he goes to jail, people are going to think that he's implicit, he's complicit with the communists. This is going to lead to areas all over the country being violated by these kinds of things. For example, these guys, the Hollywood 10. They call them the Hollywood 10. These are mostly directors and producers and writers who were in Eastern Europe, who were fighting the Nazis in Eastern Europe. And so in Eastern Europe, you had two choices. You were either a communist or you were a Nazi. You were either communist or a Nazi. And so now these individuals get to this country, and there's evidence that they're communist, that they were communists fighting the Nazis. And so what these guys do is they plead the Fifth Amendment. They refuse to give testimony to this thing. And these guys get blacklisted from Hollywood. You can read about the Hollywood 10 and see what you think about it. And it wasn't until very, very recent times that these guys are going to, they're actually, some of them never return to doing film work, directing, producing, and writing. So after this, we're going to move on to Eisenhower. Eisenhower is going to select good old Tricky Dick as his as his running mate for vice president, probably because Nixon has this reputation of being strong against communism. Eisenhower is probably far more moderate than the rest of them. So we'll get ready to start looking at Eisenhower. Following Eisenhower, you guys are going to be able to get ready to take your joyous celebration. So good luck, study hard, take your quizzes.